Hi, I'm Zewing, and today I wanted to go over the early Planetary Qualifier meta. So we just had a bunch of Planetary Qualifiers this past weekend, so what I want to do is I want to go over what I think the top decks are from that weekend, so then that way you have a better idea of what you need to build your deck to be able to have a plan and play against. So let's get into it. So coming into the rest of the month for Planetaries, I think what the pretty clear best decks right now are Boba Green, Boba Yellow, and Sabine ECL. So I think if you've been following the set 2 meta, you shouldn't be too surprised by Boba Yellow and Sabine at all. Both of these decks have had a really strong showing since the start of set 2, and I think just are really strong, just proactive decks that got a lot of really good new tools with the set. But what's really interesting is that Boba Green kind of disappeared for a long time, but definitely popped up with a large force this past weekend, where a lot of people early in set 2 were kind of abandoning Boba Green for Boba Yellow. But with these new Boba Green builds that I think kind of started in Europe maybe like a month ago, people have started to really refine these builds and make a deck that probably could be the best deck right now again. So it's going to be really interesting to see how people kind of adapt to this with the Boba Green menace here. And I'm going to kind of talk about what I think is going to probably happen with the meta and what things you really need to consider when you are tackling against Boba Green. So let's break down all these decks and kind of get into what the key pieces are when you're playing against them. So here is an example Boba Green deck list. This is from the Dallas PQ winner. I think one of the things that is really important is to kind of really know what the power cards are here. So the power cards for Boba Green really are Boba Fett's Armor and Overwhelming Barrage. Boba Fett's Armor is such a strong card in this deck especially, and just gives it another angle of attack where if you don't have an answer to a Boba Fett wearing Boba Fett's armor, you're going to be in a really have a really hard time. So it's going to be really important to be make deck building considerations so that way you are able to answer a suited up Boba, and you aren't just cold to it when they put the equipment on. Similarly with Overwhelming Barrage, this is another thing that you're going to have to be kind of really thinking about and trying to play around if you can, where you really don't want to just get completely blown out by this card. Whether that means maybe not making a trade so that way your minions or your unit's not at as low of HP or something like that. But you want to see if you can try to play around this card as much as possible so that way you either have a good follow-up when they barrage you or something else. Because this card can be super backbreaking, just give any deck playing this card just a super big advantage. Other than that, there's just the kind of the standard late game package where they're just going to have a lot of stuff, especially post board as well, going into late game. So you just need to be able to at least match that, if not go over the top of this, right? They're not playing all the Star Destroyers and everything like that. They are playing Devastators, a lot of people are, but there are ways that to go over the top of this late game package. So it's going to be really interesting to see how people kind of build their deck with this deck kind of having the target on its back, right? How people are going to build their decks in order to kind of counteract this. The next really popular deck is Boba Yellow. So this deck is pretty standard. I think the builds haven't changed a ton since early set 2. They're really still on this Bounty Hunter package where you're trying to buff up Toro and then play Bobas, Forloms, Zuckuses, and just be a really proactive kind of aggro tempo deck where you're able to bounce a lot of their stuff, Cunnings, Waylays, Cantina Bouncers, and just put a lot of damage with these kind of hard to remove units. This deck is also pretty strong, but I think Boba Yellow pilots are going to have to really consider how they're going to be building their deck with Boba Green being the best deck in the format right now. Because traditionally, I think in set 1 especially, Boba Yellow was pretty weak to Boba Green just because Boba Green was able to get their flip turn often a whole turn sooner than Boba Yellow, and that was just enough to kind of take a big advantage in the matchup. So I think you're going to have to really consider kind of how you're going to be counteracting that. Maybe that means you're playing like all 3 copies of No Good to Me Dead main or something like that in order to, delay their flip turn a little bit and that kind of thing. But Boba Yellow is just still a super strong deck and just has a really good plan into like pretty much everything, where you have a lot of really good anti-control tools too, right? You're playing the Lurking Tide Phantoms, you're playing the Bodies. So there you have a lot of game into a bunch of matchups, which makes the deck really strong, and there's just a lot of really like you can just die out of nowhere against this deck sometimes. The last deck that I think is like in top tier pretty solidly is Sabine CL. So this deck is also hasn't changed a ton since early set 2, but I think one of the things that people are pretty set on now is a lot of people are on 4 Darksabers, and the people are kind of playing these Adolphis now. Darksaber, kind of similarly to Boba Fett's armor, is another card that you really need to have a plan against, where if they just like suit up their leader, you need to just not be cold to this card, right? If they are able to put a Darksaber on Sabine and hit you twice, they probably win that game. It's pretty hard to lose from that spot. So you really need to have a plan in order to be able to deal with Darksaber and Sabine, just like you need to have a plan with how to deal with a Boba Fett's armored Boba. The thing that you really need to consider when playing against Sabine as well is, even though they're a super aggressive deck, they can actually grind pretty decently. They have a really strong top end, which is like Poes and Wreckers, and they're able to just like push a lot of extra damage, really like surprisingly kind of. Even when you think you've like stabilized, they can still just like keep topping decking Wreckers and things like that. They have casting in the Smuggle row, they have 4 Cause I Believe in. So they're able to actually just like chip you down if you aren't able to kind of close the game out once you've somewhat stabilized. So both this deck and Boba Yellow are pretty aggressive. So definitely, going into this weekend, it wouldn't be a bad idea to kind of think about how you're trying to combat these aggro decks with your deck choice. So I want to talk about a couple of other decks that I think are going to be pretty strong contenders with the meta as it is right now. And this is all these blue decks. So something like, Akira Green, either like ECL or 30 HP, Han Blue, and Boss Blue. All these like event-based, somewhat, big mid-range control decks are really able to, if they know the meta they're going into, you're able to really just kind of like tailor your removal suite in order to play against it really well. So I think especially Kira, where kind of like we saw in set 1 with when Boba Green got really popular, a lot of Krennic started becoming super popular in order to counteract that. I think Kira will perform pretty similarly in that role, where Kira generally just kind of like lines up against what Boba Green is doing pretty well. And especially like her flip can kind of just like trade for a Boba often. So that's really strong. Certainly with Han Solo Blue, you're able to just really play these like kind of battle cruiser matchups where you're able to just, against other mid-range decks, you can go really big and just kind of trade 1 for 1. And you just have a lot of top end, especially like Crate Dragon as well. So that's something that could be pretty good going into the meta. And then also this Boss Blue hard control deck, where the other thing that was performed really well against Boba Green in set 1 was these like kind of Vader Blue hard control lists. And Boss is kind of like the new evolution of that. So that could be something. I think you just need to figure out how you kind of fix your aggro matchup, because, notoriously these decks are generally pretty weak to Sabine. But if you can make that matchup not like too bad, and you can, expect to play against a bunch of like Boba Green, for example, this could be a really good choice. So looking at the Kira lists, I think they're pretty standard to what you've been seeing now. This is Wu's list from one of the PQs. One of the things that's really nice about Kira is just her top end is great and goes over the top of like Boba's top end, right? You have the Star Destroyers to be able to like close out the game. And she just has like, the ramp to match, and also like removal in order to, not die in the mid game as well. So Kira, really strong option, kind of what I was talking about if you're expecting just a lot of kind of mid-rangey Boba stuff. She generally performs pretty well into that, and I would expect an uptick in Kira, kind of similar to what we saw in set 1. The other deck that's kind of looking to counter the mid-range decks in a kind of different angle is this Han Blue deck, where you're really looking to get this discard package working. And a lot of people are playing like more pillages, K2s, force throws. You can get to a spot where, because Boba just deploys all of his stuff really fast, they often just get to a spot where they have like maybe 2 cards in hand. And I've had pillages where you just like make them discard like a Maul and a Vader, and that's like crazy. So this deck, you know, it has a really strong late game as well. Crate Dragon is a crazy card. And you just have this like discard package in order to make some of their turns really awkward and get you to this like late game position where you can stabilize. So I think another good option, this is probably another good option going into future weeks as well. Finally, we have this like Boss Blue hard control list where you're basically just playing a bunch of removal in order to try to get into Super Laser Blast and then close out the game with like an Avenger or a Crate Dragon. This list, I think, will be pretty strong if you can develop a like solid plan into Sabine. It doesn't have to be like a perfect, like 50-50 or whatever. You could be slightly loose into Sabine, but if you expect to play against a bunch of Bobas, this could be a really good choice. The thing is, compared to like Han Blue and Kira, I think those decks are a little bit easier for people to pick up, so I would expect to see them at like a decent rate in the meta. But Boss Blue is just a really hard deck, and not a lot of people can kind of just like pick up and play this deck. So I wouldn't expect that for this deck to have a really high meta share, but I would expect that there are probably going to be some pilots who have some kind of hard control shell like this, where that end up doing really well because they're able to kind of understand what they're targeting and build their deck accordingly. So if you are a hard control fan, this might be something for you to consider, and might be a good time to kind of bring this out now. So those are the main decks that I want to talk about. I think I'm going to probably have some of like the biggest meta share, and you really need to have a plan of how you are playing into those. You need to be practicing those matchups. A couple other decks that I think are pretty interesting is Emperor Palpatine. So I think Emperor Palpatine could also potentially see an uptick in the meta as well. This is kind of like a like level 3 deck, right? If we think that level 1 is Boba, level 2 is these blue decks in order to beat Boba, then Palpatine can go over the top of some of these blue decks as well. So potentially, sometimes you just have to be, when playing Palpatine, you have to just be okay losing to Sabine sometimes. But if you're okay with that and you can get a bunch of like favorable mid-range matchups where you can go over the top of them, that could be a decent choice. Han Solo, on the other hand, I actually would expect to see a downtick. Both Han Solo Yellow and Han Solo Green really struggle into Boba. So if a lot of people are going to be bringing Boba on future weeks, Han Solo is going to be a pretty hard deck to play into that meta. So that's something to consider as well if you were really looking to pilot that deck. The other thing is there's just a lot of other decks that I think are a little underexplored in the meta. Stuff like other colors of Boba, right? Like Boba Red, Boba Blue, other colors of Han. There's like Han Green, that's similar to Sabine. There's just a bunch of other leaders as well, stuff like Cad Bane and Rey. And I think it's, as long as you really know how to play into the top decks and like what your plan is into those matchups, there's a lot of like really viable stuff that you can play right now. And I think that's really interesting. So with all of that to say, I want to just say that wish you good luck at your future planetaries. I'm going to be covering a bunch of different things about the different planetary results and things like that, so be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.